Welcome to this public webinar run by Next25 in collaboration with the UTS Transdisciplinary School. In the spirit of reconciliation, Next25 acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I'm Prof. Spackman, CEO of independent non-profit Think and Do Tank Next25. And today I'm joined by Associate Professor Fanny Salignac, the Director of Research at UTS TD School, Associate Professor Baumber, Director of Teaching and Learning at the TD School, and Dr. Sam Wearne, researcher at the UTS Institute for Sustainable Futures. And today we're going to be looking at constructive discussion as a potential lever for improving the way Australia makes its future so that we as a nation can flourish. And we're going to be looking at this through the prism of the Sydney Housing Challenge. But first, how did we get here and why are we approaching this challenge in this way? So Next25 is on a mission to ensure that Australia has what it takes to make the future its people want. We do this through research into three key questions. What is the future Australia wants? Are we on track? And if not, what are the deep contributing factors of Australia's underperformance and levers to shift them? And then we build initiatives or interventions based on the levers we discover through our research. Next25's Recoded Research Program has uncovered 5 systemic levers or major opportunities to improve Australia's performance. These are a galvanising national identity, benchmarks beyond GDP, constructive discussion, engaged decision-making, and trust in government. Today, we'll hear from Fanny, Alex, and Sam on research undertaken over the past year with a focus on delving deeper into our constructive discussion lever. This is a chance to share and reflect on phase 1 of our work together, where we drill down on unpacking and exploring the concept of constructive discussion, including what we could learn from what already exists and how we might create our own new hybrid model, and to engage with stakeholders to get a deeper and more nuanced understanding of how constructive discussion does or does not happen in the context of the Sydney Housing Challenge, so that we can build a picture of where it may be useful to intervene. This is also an opportunity to inspire and connect with all of you for the next upcoming phases of our work. We're called Next25 because 25 years is what is commonly understood to be a generation. Since its inception over 12 years ago, Next25's mission is to shift the focus from short-term band-aid solutions or knee-jerk reactions and consider how we can work at a systemic level to transform Australia's future in the long term. This can be really challenging. We're grappling with really complex, systemic, polarizing issues that are often many years in the making. Therefore, we invite you to join us in our efforts to, as a first step, deeply understand the challenges we face and consider the possibilities and where the bright spots or opportunities for change lie. Thank you for joining us. We first started working with the TD School back in 2021 after meeting with Case Dorst and Roger Watson, both UTS academics, and subsequently invited Roger to be on Next25's research committee. We also engaged Chris Reedy from the UTS Institute for Sustainable Futures at UTS, who also worked on this project that we're discussing today, in a steering committee along with Lynn Reeder from Federation University Australia and James Arvanatakis from the Forest Research Foundation based in Perth. This steering committee worked with Next25 on the initial stages of our exploration into constructive discussion, which included 2 workshops to explore and understand more about the challenge of enabling constructive discussion from a cross-sector perspective, including 21 diverse stakeholders from across the future-making system. And the collective insights and ideas that emerge from those 2 initial exploratory workshops are available on Next25's website and fed into the work we've done since. In 2023, we built on this work further with Next25's research report, Contested Spaces, Australia, the Referendum, and Constructive Discussion, which offers insights into the key barriers and enabling factors that people in Australia encountered when discussing the then proposed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament. And we ran a webinar similar to this one on our findings in the lead up to last year's referendum. And that report and webinar are also available on Next25's website, which brings us to the work that we're discussing today. There's a deep alignment between Next25 and the UTS TD School in terms of our commitment to understanding and addressing complex challenges and the spirit of humility, experimentation, and genuine collaboration that underpins both our approaches. So we're really pleased to have built so many great relationships with UTS staff and academics at both the TD School and at the Institute for Sustainable Futures. And at this point, I'd really like to acknowledge all of the other UTS academics who worked on this project with us who are not speaking on today's webinar. Chris Reedy, Scott Matter, Luis Lozano Paredes, Monique Potts, Helena Robinson, as well as Next25 Stephanie Mason, who is currently running this webinar, and Dr. Claire Redden. Before we dive into the report findings, I just want to acknowledge the incredible response we had to the webinar and the great questions we received in the registration process. We've made efforts to respond to all of these, at least thematically, across the presentation, where and when we had an appropriate response. And with that, I'm going to pass to Fanny Salignac, Director of Research at UTS TD School. Thanks, Fanny.
Thank you so much, Chloe. I'll try and be quick so I don't take too much time away from Alex and Sam telling us about all this amazing research. So as Chloe said, I'm Associate Professor Fanny Salignac. I'm the Director of Research at the Transdisciplinary School at UTS. In a very similar way to Next25, we are interested in addressing complex issues. So we believe that transdisciplinary thinking and methods can help us do that by looking deeper in the root causes of these issues, but also leveraging the depth of mutually reinforcing disciplines and expertise. So at TD, we aim to act as a conduit between UTS and industry, and so provide a space to harness the breadth of UTS expertise to create meaningful and impactful change. So our work with Next25 is one of our exemplar research partnership, which we value immensely, and we're looking forward to all the amazing work that we are and will be doing together. Over to you, Alex.
Great, thanks very much, Fanny. Just building on the idea that this was very much something that Next25 had been working on for a number of years prior to us getting involved, and on a personal level, I've been involved for about 18 months. So I do want to give credit to all of those workshops and processes and exploration that took place before that. But where we really came into the picture with this particular project was to try to unpack this idea of constructive discussion a bit further. This idea that had been built up and explored by Next25 over a few years. And one of our starting points was to look at some of the definitions that had emerged. So you'll see there the definition on the left came out of a 2022 report from Next25, which defined it as communication that is of useful and beneficial purpose, creating an environment where decision-making better reflects the shared view of the public interest with respect to the common good. So you can see there the idea of useful and beneficial fitting with that idea of constructive, that we're trying to get somewhere with this form of discussion, but also this idea of decision-making. This might help with better decision-making. On the right-hand side, there is another definition from a 2023 report, which has a slightly different nuance. It also focuses on the idea of, you can see there, the idea of a productive manner. So constructive and productive, we're aiming to achieve something. But this one talks about a communicative activity and process where people have the space and opportunity to share perspectives and explore difference. So less of a focus on decision-making and more of a focus on exploring the differences and letting those surface and emerge in these conversations. And I guess we wanted to explore these different dimensions, recognizing that when you have those constructive discussions, they may, head towards decision-making processes, but they may more be about helping to surface the differences, and perhaps a bit of both, and maybe different stages in the process. So this was kind of our starting point to think about how we can unpack this. And I guess being a team of transdisciplinary academics with sort of depth in different disciplines from where we've come from, we immediately identified that there was an opportunity to build on some work that had been done in all these different disciplines. There are a whole range of different frameworks and concepts that already exist that we could draw on, and that each of us were familiar with in different ways. So just looking across the team that we had, and there was a list there before of all the different people who've been involved. We had backgrounds in business studies, environmental studies, urban planning and architecture, psychology, education, anthropology. So this huge range of different experience. And through that, we had an understanding and experience working with a range of different frameworks. So we thought, rather than try and reinvent everything, we wanted to explore what was already out there that might be relevant to bring to bear on this. So if you move on to the next slide, Steph, this is the framework that we came up with to help guide us. And Chris Reedy, who was mentioned before, was really instrumental in thinking this through and helping to come up with these 4 different levels in which constructive discussion might happen. So at the personal level or personal sphere, you've really got individual people's capabilities of, how they can come to a discussion and a conversation with others, and what personal attributes they might bring with them, how they might actually improve those capabilities over time by focusing on how they engage with others. The conversational is much more about the one-on-one, or maybe a few handful of people interacting, and how they have those conversations in fairly small settings, how they listen to one another, how they think before they speak to one another. If you move on to the institutional sphere, you're getting into much more formal sort of structures, where you might be focusing on bringing larger numbers of people together with a specific purpose, guiding them through carefully designed processes, and potentially trying to achieve a decision-making process at the end of it. And then the cultural sphere really thinks about all the things that sit over the top of all of that and influence the way that we engage as individuals, the way we have conversations, the way we set up our institutions, some of the assumptions and norms that guide us, how things like the media influence what we do, how things like narratives emerge across society. So yeah, we really had to sort of tease out these different spheres and recognize that lots of the frameworks and concepts that we were familiar with sat in different spaces in this sphere. If you move on to the next slide, I think that will show us how those different spheres interact with a range of these different concepts. So this was kind of the first stage of the work that we did. There was a 2-stage process, and Sam, who's coming up next, is going to talk about the second stage. But as part of this first stage, we felt it was important to really unpack all of these different frameworks and concepts that we were all familiar with previously, and try to garner some insights from them, some practical insights that might be helpful for exploring how you would go about enabling constructive discussion in a particular context. And then Sam, when he talks later, will talk about the context that we decided to unpack, which was the housing system within Sydney. And I should also note that this work was funded by an internal UTS collaboration grant, which meant that we could do these 2 programs of work. So we identified a range of different frameworks. There's about a dozen there that we settled on in the end. We started with a longer list, but we kind of settled down on those ones there. And then we decided to delve into each of those frameworks and undertake a literature review, to find out how they'd been used, how they had been defined, and come up with some of those practical insights. And Luis Hernando Lozano Paredes, who was mentioned earlier, was really the key person leading that literature review component. Once we'd had some workshops and come up with this framework, and then settled on these different frameworks that we wanted to explore. So you can see they're not a perfect fit. None of them reside exactly in one sphere. There's really a lot of overlap between them. So it was a complex task to try to match them to the different spheres, but we recognize that some of them sit more in certain spheres than others. So if you start really at the personal sphere, there's things like reflexivity and transformative learning. And these are concepts that we use quite a bit at UTS when we're working with our students, and we try to build up those capabilities in our students. So reflexivity really refers to this idea that you're consciously unpacking things like values and beliefs and worldviews and social norms, and you're thinking about how they influence the way you might approach a situation. So you can think about if you're going into a conversation or a discussion with someone, it might be really important to first reflect on the values that you're bringing to that space. And this reflexivity piece, I guess it's a capability, but it can almost become an attribute of an individual, that they kind of do this kind of thing automatically when they're going into those settings, or they pause when they're in the middle of conversations and discussions and think about their values and how they might be influencing how they're approaching it versus how someone else might be approaching it. Yeah, on the flip side of that is empathy, where you're really trying to understand the values and the worldviews that the other people in that conversation are bringing with them. Transformative learning really is about saying, okay, can we actually change some of those beliefs and norms and assumptions that we might be carrying with us, and what processes might help to achieve that? So there's a lot of work in that space that looks at the idea of disorienting dilemmas, that you might actually need to be put in quite a difficult situation to really challenge some of the ways that you're thinking about things and be exposed to people who do things in a very different way, think in a different way, a context that's very different. So, for example, if you were traveling to a different country, or you were placed in an environment with a bunch of people who do things in a very different way, it can be really disorienting, but also it can be one of those moments where you actually realize a lot about yourself and how you approach the world. And really, I guess some of the key insights around transformative learning are things like there's a combination of the setting, the kind of context that you might be put in and how you can create an enabling environment for transformative learning, but also what are some of the deliberate processes that you might guide people through to get them to reflect on what they think, what their starting point is, and how that might be challenged by what they're experiencing. As you start to move into the conversational sphere, this is really where people start to interact with one another. So something like non-violent communication is one that's been explored over probably 50 years or something now. Marshall Rosenberg was really critical in coming up with that idea of non-violent communication. And it has a few central tenets to it, things like judgment-free observations, describing your subjective feelings and acknowledging the underlying needs of others. But there's also a lot of really good insights there around some of the settings that you might use around nonviolent communication. So it's been used in places like schools to overcome things like violence in school settings, and try to understand why people might be resorting to violence and how you can have conversations in those spaces that take the place of violence and prevent it. Particularly things like prisons, substance abuse. It's been used in conservation science to look at human-wildlife coexistence rather than conflict. So there's a lot of really practical insights of where that's been used in ways that can diffuse situations. Appreciative inquiry is really an approach that says, look, let's look for the positive elements of things rather than looking for the sources of conflicts between us. The 4 levels of listening is a framework developed by Otto Scharmer. And that really focuses on how we listen to one another, going beyond sort of some of the lower levels of listening to really some higher level listening where you're, one of them is empathic listening, where you're listening with empathy and trying to understand the values of the other person, and also generative listening, where you're really listening to try to find the opportunities that might emerge from the conversation. So you can see how some of these personal and conversational elements really help to prepare an individual for going into these conversations. And then when they start talking to one another, thinking about how they're interacting with one another and being really conscious about how you do that. If you move more into the institutional sphere, you get things like deliberative democracy. And that's been used quite a lot in lots of different settings to try to overcome contentious issues and settle on decision-making processes around those. So there's things like citizen assemblies that are used quite often as part of deliberative democracy processes. So rather than having representatives elected and going to Canberra to make decisions and pass legislation, it might actually draw on everyday citizens and getting them involved in assemblies and exposing them to issues and asking them to reach a consensus at the end of that process. You can do it through polls and online processes as well. Participatory futuring is much more focused on, again, that participatory, getting local communities and affected stakeholders involved, but doing things like getting them into workshops where you might develop a vision of the future. You might undertake some scenario development and assessing possible scenarios, or things like backcasting, where you imagine the future that you might want together, and then you work backwards from there to think about what steps are required to reach that preferred future. So those are much more institutional structures. You actually have to have get reasonably large groups of people together and have quite a clear process that you guide them through. And then lastly, there's the cultural sphere, where you're really thinking about all those things that sit on top of all of those elements that we've discussed already and influence them in various different ways from the cultural level. So things like narratives, the different narratives that play out in society, which can often sit behind particular paradigms or ideologies. So perhaps a neoliberal ideology might generate certain narratives about, for example, the way we structure our education system. And then there's opportunities to potentially flip those narratives and say, what if we told different stories about the purpose of education? Or in the context of what we're going to move on to next, thinking about something like housing, how might you tell different stories about what the purpose of housing is? And then, of course, media, thinking about the role of media in influencing those narratives and how you can be proactive in changing some of those. And lastly, social license to operate, which really is about understanding not just how you get an official regulatory license to undertake an action, but how you might get that community buy-in and community support for the viability of that in the long term. And that has a lot of focus on things like trust, but also really carefully thinking about who are the beneficiaries and where are the costs being borne of a particular activity. All right, so if we move on to the next slide, we then really wanted to look through all of these spheres and go, where are the barriers and leverage points where you might be able to enable constructive discussion to occur, and what insights and intervention strategies are offered by those different frameworks? So I've touched on quite a few of them there. Things like deliberative democracy throw out the idea of citizen assemblies, whereas something like transformative learning throws out the idea of things like disorienting dilemmas and how you can introduce those into the mix, how you could train people up in reflexivity. And then lastly, that point about how you might actually integrate and target and operationalize all of these together. So if you move on to the next slide, we've got an example of thinking through how that might actually take place, where we don't necessarily just want to pick one of these frameworks or even one of these spheres. Some of the richest opportunities might lie in thinking about how you could combine them together. So for example, you've got things like participatory futuring and also deliberative democracy. With those come a range of different activities that have already been developed. There's lots of resources on these that are already out there. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. You can draw on these particular activities and structure these institutions and say, how can we get local communities involved in these visioning workshops or citizen assemblies? But then once you've decided you're going to do that, if you step back into the personal and conversational spheres, there's lots of insights you can draw on about how can we actually prepare people to come into these settings in a way where they've got an open mind, where they're interested in listening to other people's perspectives. So for example, in the reflexivity space is the idea of reframing, which is something we use quite a bit with our students at UTS. Also empathy building, how can you get people thinking about empathy, and some of those different higher levels of listening, of how can you actually get people trained before they come into those settings for how they're going to listen to others in those settings. And then at the opposite end of the spectrum, you've got the cultural domain, where you might think about what are the narratives that are influencing how people are coming into those settings. So if you've got a deliberative democracy setting, is it being influenced by a narrative around neoliberalism? And what might that mean if you flip those kinds of narratives, and maybe you could intervene in those narratives before people come into it or during the deliberative democracy activity to get people thinking in a different frame. Also, media interventions and things like social license to operate as well. So it's really the opportunity to try to combine those that really emerged as probably the strongest insight from that particular piece of work. I'm going to hand over now to Sam so he can give more of an example of a specific context. So that was the second part of the work that we started to do to think about how we might explore constructive discussion in a specific context. So Sam?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Alex. Yeah, so alongside those conceptual explorations, we wanted to try and ground our research in constructive discussion in relation to a specific issue. And so today I'm going to give you an overview of the work that we've done and continue to do to look at constructive discussion in relation to Sydney's housing challenge. I guess to set the scene, we had two main questions that we wanted to investigate here. First, we wanted to understand to what extent can constructive discussion be used to explain the dynamics of governance and decision-making on the topic of housing in Sydney. And then we wanted to understand how might we test or design interventions in Sydney that can provide opportunities for constructive discussion and hopefully make a productive contribution to Sydney's housing crisis. So I'll explain how we went about the research. I'll share some key insights that we found, and I'll discuss what this means moving forward in terms of potential opportunity spaces. Next slide, please. So at this project, it's an initial exercise to try and scope, is housing and constructive discussion, are they related? Is this a relevant theme on which that we might work? And if so, where and why? What might we do? So we designed our research using a small-scale qualitative approach that let us consider the detail and the richness of different perspectives among stakeholders. As my colleagues have outlined, Next 25 have been thinking about constructive discussion for quite some time. And so we wanted to build on that. And on the right, you can see this figure or this heuristic that they use to think about how the future comes about in Australian society. And so in this future-making system, you can see there's different actors that represent the public. And ideally, we find ways of bringing them together to discuss how we might address big issues and work toward the long-term common good. So we use this heuristic and this concept when we were designing our research. We tried to get good representation from each of the different group of actors here. And on top of that, we also recognize that anyone who reads the paper knows that there's some common viewpoints you might hear when we discuss housing in Sydney or in many other contexts in Australia. And we wanted to try and get representative voices from those different viewpoints. So we heard from people that might be able to speak on behalf of different interests, so different age groups. We heard from people who might be part of groups with other pro-development or anti-development type standpoints. We heard from people who could represent the views of people experiencing homelessness, people who are renting, homeowners, people living in community and social housing. And in terms of politicians, housing is a bit of a complex one. So we didn't listen to federal level politicians, but we did hear from a good variety of local and state politicians. And we heard from 3 major political parties who have current or previous responsibilities for the housing portfolio. So from a small sample size or manageable sample size of 16 people, we felt like we gained a really valuable set of viewpoints from which we could kind of get into the depth of the way that housing and constructive discussion might relate. Next slide, please. In terms of the analytical process, we used a very common approach in social science and qualitative research called reflexive thematic analysis. So what we did is we conducted our interviews and we transcribed those recordings. We coded them for patterns in what people talked about, and we started to think about the themes that might be present and how those themes might relate and what they might tell us about housing, governance, and decision-making in relation to constructive discussion. On the right, you can see some artifacts from that process. The colourful ones that are too small to read from the kind of coding and thematic sense-making process. On the bottom, you can see us looking at enablers and barriers across the 4 spheres that Alex just introduced, thinking about how that might let us understand some of the patterns and themes that were raised. And on the top, you can see that we've also drawn on theory. So in academia, amongst members of our team, we were thinking about the role of discourse and decision-making in democracies and drawing on sociocultural theories about housing and planning. So I will kind of caveat before we get into the findings that we do have a paper that we've drafted that captures the nuance of this work, and I'm not going to be able to cover that in its depth and entirety. Instead, I'll draw out some of the key insights that we're left with that I think will be useful for you. And if you want to read the preprint, we can share that with you, and we'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback on that as well. Next slide, please. So this slide captures 3 overarching insights that we're left with, and I'll go through them. So first of all, we found that constructive discussion as a way to frame those conversations was quite interesting. It seemed to work as a bit of a boundary concept. What I mean by that is there are multiple ways that you might immediately think constructive discussion means, depending on what you care about and what you're kind of interested in. And we found that flexibility of meaning was quite useful. So it seemed to set a useful tone in the conversations that was explorative and open with participants. As you might know from personal experience, and part of the reason why we chose housing is that it can be quite an emotional topic. And you often hear people speaking from relatively set positions. Sometimes the people adopt adversarial or defensive positions when they enter into conversations. And they can be challenging conversations to have amongst your family, amongst strangers. We see this all the time. So it was really interesting that when we framed the conversation about housing and the housing system via constructive discussion, we seem to avoid a lot of those politics. And generally, people from across the political spectrum and those various different viewpoints that we selected them for tended to present kind of politically neutral perspectives, and they really did seem to try and speak from themselves and talk about what might be useful and beneficial to the system as a whole. And so that was really interesting, and that was really good. The second point there is the diagnostic tool. So again, we're not the only people interested in Sydney's housing challenges. It's quite a noisy space, and I'm sure on the call there's a lot of established experts who understand the details and the technical elements of the planning system and perhaps that aspect of the housing challenge. We're looking at it from a slightly different perspective by using constructive discussion as our prism or our lens through which to look at this. And that proved to be interesting and useful. And so we think that using constructive discussion as a way of exploring this issue was new and interesting. And another caveat, I guess, is to say it's difficult to study a hot topic like this because things don't change. And so as I introduced some of the diagnosis that we came to, some things have shifted since we had our interviews and have analysed the themes and topics in that. And some of it seems to be positive, but the broad trends, I think, are still relevant. And the third point there is talking about leverage points for change. Why are we doing this is because we're trying to identify where we might design interventions that can help. And so, spoiler, we did find that there's many potential sites for intervention which emerge when you look at the housing challenge through constructive discussion. And there are a lot of different opportunities in the different spheres that Alex has talked to. So the key finding is, yes, constructive discussion seems very relevant to the issue of housing, and there are a lot of opportunities to do some good work that can make a difference. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the interviews that we did were very rich, and unfortunately, I don't have time to kind of do the nuance and depth of those insights and discussions justice. So instead, I'm going to focus on the broad takeaways. Now, you might have seen this figure in the advertisements for this webinar, and I appreciate that it's a bit complex. There's a fair bit going on here, so I'm going to try and gently step you through what it's trying to say. There's two levels to this. This is the themes that we found in the white, and it's relating it to some theories in the literature in the kind of the green text in the background. The main message is at the point one is really just to say that Australia's approach to housing, from what we heard in our interviews, has seemed to lack clarity about its overarching goals. What is it that we are trying to achieve? Are we trying to build private wealth? Are we trying to provide shelter? And relatedly, what is the role of the state? What's the role of the market? What's the role of the individual? Without that clarity, we have a kind of a governance system that is trying to do multiple things. And the second theme that emerged was that it seems like a de facto policy discourse has emerged over time, which tends to treat housing as an asset class. And this isn't necessarily an explicit or deliberate policy approach. It's also a bit of an inherited policy discourse, and it has consequences. And so we see that agenda influence various structures, tools, and practices used in the way we make decisions about housing. Again, we're not looking at this from a kind of a technical perspective in like policy theory. We're looking at this through the perspective of constructive discussion. And when we look at the structures, tools, and practices used in the current system to manage housing, it was really interesting what participants raised. They suggested there's a systemic lack of constructive discussion within various forums and processes that are used. And this exists at various different scales. So from the development approvals kind of process to zoning decisions to kind of national level discussions. So participants raised things like issues of representation, in how and which parts of the public are heard when we're making decisions about housing, a lack of forums and processes that could support better representation, or tweaking the current process that we do have, for example, at local government level, to make sure that we're hearing a diversity of viewpoints when we make decisions. Through to more of those individual kind of personal behaviours, so that people pointed to common but poor performances in how people often approach discussions about housing in the forums that do exist. There are also broader issues at play here too. So in the 4th and 5th points on the figure. So on the one hand, people were very critical of the role of the media and asking if it is doing its job to help us to be reflective and self-correct as a society when we look at the outcomes that are being produced by the current situation. And then more broadly, other people, or the same people, also talked about broad structural issues that can create a challenge here. So asking if we have the proper forums and structures that give that representation and allocate power and decision-making so that we can actually come to decisions for the long-term common good and set people up so that we have those a constructive discussion in the right forum. So to keep this consumable, I really just wanted to emphasize that you can see that constructive discussion raises a whole range of issues that span different spheres that Alex has talked to, and that spans different scales as well. So by understanding where there's a lack of constructive discussion, we also identified in those same conversations where there are potential opportunities to improve it. And I'll move on to the next slide because that can help us to cover some of that. So I'm going to start with the figure on the right, and I'll come back to the text on the left. So this is also part of the analytical process of our work. This is mapping out different areas where participants felt that there's an opportunity to improve constructive discussion in the system. So again, too much detail, and this is just the first level. There's a lot of really specific ideas that sit underneath this, but I'll start on the left of the figure around discursive reorientation. So some ideas here talked about the process of selecting what is the dominant policy discourse that we want in society. That should be a political process and part of the core process in democracy. And so some of the ideas here were really similar to some of the work that Next 25 does through the Navigator project. And I thought that was quite validating. And you'll see there's a whole range of areas here where I think Next 25's strategy in how to support constructive discourse was reiterated when we look at the issue of housing. And you can see opportunities where you might tweak or nuance those approaches if you want to focus on housing. But similarly, where some ideas that are specific to housing could be perhaps applied to other issues as well. So there's particular narrative strategies that people talked about in terms of reframing how we discuss housing in relation to aging, with the idea that that might shift the tone of the discussion and kind of shift people's politics in the way that we talk to one another, or different groups talk to one another. There were also structural opportunities up the top that talked about various scales of power and decision-making. So designing constructive discussion into processes at the site of a specific development or a strata committee or a state government kind of policy being developed, etc. There were also calls for, maybe at the national level, this is a great example where deliberative democracy and citizen juries might be good to work out what is our national kind of agenda on housing. There were opportunities raised about how politicians might listen better to the communities that they represent, and through to kind of challenges and reflections on the loss of shared forums in society that used to be very valuable in helping us come to these kind of shared perspectives on what kind of future we want. There's a whole range of ideas on the right talking about training specific individuals who hold roles in relation to housing, and Next 25 does some of that work really well already. And so, yeah, that's similar ideas there in relation to housing that could be translocated. And there were also, I mentioned before, some critiques of the media. And so I know there's some really interesting and valuable work being done on constructive journalism by groups at Monash, and that was raised when we talked about housing too. So overall, I guess, yes, there's a bit of vindication in some of the strategies that Next 25 has already been using, and there's a lot of overlaps when we looked at this topic in relation to the 4 spheres that Alex mentioned. And we can see there's a whole range of potential here in how we might design some strategies, depending on which specific point we want to make a difference on. I'll hand it back to you now, Chloe.
Thanks, Sam. And thank you, Fanny, Alex, and Sam, for everything that you've taken us through so far. I'm just going to take the opportunity to ask 1 or 2 questions of all of you, both of you. And thinking about this, reflecting on what you touched on about there being a vision or a purpose for housing in Australia and the future of housing in Australia. And maybe I'll start by asking you, Alex, can you think of any methods or frameworks or spheres, going back to what you shared, that would be particularly pertinent to draw upon if we were going to collectively develop this vision or purpose for Australian housing for the future?
Yeah, thanks, Chloe. I'm happy to have a first stab at it, and I might pass on to Sam to talk more specifically about the housing side of things. Yeah, certainly in terms of the frameworks we reviewed and that the model we developed with the 4 spheres, I think that idea of coming up with a collective vision for housing, there's a lot of things you could draw on from that. Definitely the institutional sphere would be a really important one to think about, and there are a few models there, but I guess participatory futuring probably really jumps out as one of the models we looked at in that institutional sphere, which has that heavy focus on coming together with a collective vision of what you want the future to be. But I would also add, in the process of unpacking those different frameworks, we also explored that tension between coming to a consensus on something versus allowing differences and differences of opinion to emerge and surface and be respected. So yeah, one of the frameworks I didn't talk about so much, but it was in our list, was agonistic democracy, and that has a kind of a different approach to, say, deliberative democracy, where it tends to focus not so much on converging on a decision together, but it instead has a much stronger focus on that idea of surfacing all the different opinions. And sometimes it's called agonistic pluralism, because it's really about recognizing there's a pluralism of different opinions out there and ideas out there, and the values and beliefs and everything that underpin those different opinions. So I think you could draw on different elements of the institutional sphere. You could potentially combine them in different ways, maybe have a 2-stage kind of process where you had to focus more on the agonistic democracy side of things first to allow people's different opinions to surface and be respected, but then possibly complement that with processes from something like participatory futuring, which then get people working together on coming together around a vision. And then, of course, you could draw on those other spheres to influence how you go about doing that. So you might draw on the personal sphere to get people thinking about the values and beliefs they're bringing to those settings, which might help them to be more respectful. So something like nonviolent communication would be a great one to help prepare people to go into an agonistic democracy setting where they're going to be respectful of other people's opinions. You can also think about some of the practical insights from some of those frameworks about where you might do that kind of thing. So quite a few of the frameworks, nonviolent communication, agonistic democracy, have a strong focus on sort of neutral spaces. So things like public libraries or schools or public buildings, public open spaces can often be more neutral spaces that enable that kind of discussion. Yeah, so maybe I'll leave it there, but I think there's definitely lots of the spheres you could draw on and lots of those frameworks that would be really helpful for that visioning piece.
You want me to add briefly?
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think the context really matters. And so there's a whole range of forums in which you could do that visioning work and at different scales, which are all valuable, and that's kind of a choice. And so, there were some really good ideas inspired by work that's currently happening, for example, about how can politicians kind of make the most out of consultations and engagement processes with their constituents. And so that's a forum, right? And you would design an intervention for that forum very specifically, which is quite different if you wanted to do something more quantitative, where you wanted to kind of get as many people as possible to kind of feed into a listening, kind of big listening tool to hear about what Australians want for the future. Very different contexts, very different scales. So I think yeah, there's no like one answer. A lot of those tools are really useful, and you can reapply them depending on the context. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And Sam, I have another question for you, which is, obviously you got to be involved in the interviews with a lot of stakeholders, which is always a really interesting process. So a bit more of an overarching one, but was there anything that surprised you when you were having the conversations with stakeholders? Anything that really jumped out as being different or unexpected?
Yeah, thank you. Two things. So the first one was, we deliberately chose to sample people with very different viewpoints, or we expected them to have different viewpoints. And I was surprised that generally people sounded like reasonable people, and generally no one was happy with the bad social outcomes that are currently being produced, and everyone wanted to see something better. And I think a lot of the times you could kind of ignore the role of the interviewee or the participant, and you might not know where their day job is, or kind of where their alignment is. And so I thought that was really interesting and really encouraging, actually, to say that there's something systemic here, I think, that's stopping us from making good decisions for the long-term common good, and people care about that and they have good ideas about it. So that was the first thing that I thought was really interesting. And it gets to that point about, well, is constructive discussion does it actually invite you in to have difficult discussions? And does it spark something in you when you come into that engagement that's helpful? And the second one was the critique of the media. There was a lot of really shrewd and sharp reflections on the role that the media has in relation to housing. So this idea of it kind of driving FOMO, driving the fear of missing out, kind of driving speculation, and, playing a role that's almost the antithesis of what we would hope it to in some respects. So I wasn't expecting that to be such a strong theme, but it was definitely there. So those were the two things that kind of stuck out to me.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. And that rings true, certainly for me and the work we've done over the years with Next 25. The media comes up regularly across many different issues that we explore. So I feel like that's definitely somewhere or an element that needs to be considered. Thank you to all of you. I do have more to share, but so there's time before the webinar closes, we've got a link in the chat function that will take you to a very short evaluation survey. And I think there's a QR code as well. There's just 2 multiple choice questions, so it's very quick. And if you want to keep listening rather than be distracted, you might just want to open the link now so you can have the webpage open while you listen to the rest. I think it's clear that there's a lot of fertile ground for constructive discussion to have an impact in the area of Sydney housing, and most likely that there are lessons that can be applied not only to the housing challenge in other parts of Australia or New South Wales for that matter, because of course this is not just a Sydney issue, but also perhaps to other similar complex and contested issues Australia faces, just as we explored last year in our paper in the lead up to the referendum. So as I mentioned at the start of the webinar, what we've shared today is insights from phase 1 of our work on constructive discussion and the Sydney Housing Challenge. And from here, the next step is to zero in on a couple of those potential intervention spaces Sam discussed, and using the models and frameworks that Alex spoke about to design and test a few different possible interventions, get some rapid feedback and refine. There are some promising movements and examples to look at in this space. So in early July, the Paris City Council took up major legislation addressing homelessness, written by a permanent citizens' assembly composed of 100 regular people, and passed it directly into law. So that's an example of a framework or method in what Alex referred to as the institutional sphere. So there were 40 citizens in the homelessness working group who met over the course of a year, which culminated in the writing of a citizens' bill on homelessness, the actual legislation. There is, of course, a movement in Australia on housing as a human right, which of course is relevant to or response to Sam's observation from his interviews about the lack of clarity in Australia's mission and aspiration for housing, and how this leaves a vacuum which can either be filled by a mission or guiding principle that is at best unhelpful and at worst potentially really damaging. So there's a lot of great and important work being done. In terms of constructive discussion itself, as was mentioned by both Alex and Sam, Next 25 has been working for many years with federal and state MPs on values-based leadership and transformation of self and system. And we employ a lot of the frameworks Alex referred to in his work, particularly in our initiative, Transforming Parliament for Women. So we've learned a lot of lessons through that work, which can be helpful too. So after today, Next 25 will email all attendees a copy of this recording with links to the 2 papers we discussed. So those who are interested can read and dive into all of that nuance. And there's also an opportunity to let us know if you'd like to be involved in the next steps with us. So as I explained earlier on, in all of the work we've done today, collaborating with stakeholders from across the system is a fundamental practice for us and the success of what we're trying to achieve. So we know there are a lot of people and organisations joining us today with deep knowledge and experience and technical expertise from differing parts of the system, and in particular, different parts of the housing system. And we'd love to work with you or hear your feedback on what resonated with you from phase 1 of our work and how we might approach the next design phase. I just want to check if anyone wants to add anything else, Fanny, Alex, or Sam. No? Okay, well, in that case, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for your time and your interest. We know there's many demands on your attention, and we're really grateful that you've spent this time with us this morning. We wish you a wonderful weekend, and we hope to touch base with all of you again very soon.